The village hall of St. Mary Mead had never looked more festive, nor felt more charged with the particular tension that accompanies any gathering where people must be on their best behavior while harboring their worst thoughts. The annual Christmas tree ceremony was, as Mrs. Prowse, the vicar's wife, had declared with characteristic determination, to be absolutely perfect this year, a pronouncement that, in Miss Jane Marple's considerable experience, was rather like challenging fate to prove otherwise. The great pine tree stood in the center of the hall, its branches heavy with handmade decorations and strings of fairy lights that cast a warm, golden glow over the assembled villagers. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, mulled wine, and the particular mixture of anticipation and barely suppressed gossip that marked all St. Mary Mead's social occasions. Children pressed close to the tree, their eyes wide with wonder, while their parents maintained the sort of vigilant cheerfulness that suggested they were prepared for either triumph or disaster. Miss Marple sat quietly on a wooden chair near the back of the hall, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm as she worked on a pink scarf for her great-niece. To the casual observer, she appeared to be the very picture of a harmless elderly lady, absorbed in her needlework and occasionally glancing up with mild interest at the proceedings. Those who knew her better, however, might have noticed that her pale blue eyes were remarkably active, taking in details that others overlooked entirely. She observed, for instance, the way Mr. Edwin Larch, the church treasurer, kept checking his pocket watch with increasing frequency, his normally ruddy face bearing an unhealthy pallor. She noted how Mrs. Victoria Fletcher, the elegant newcomer who had purchased Thornfield Cottage 18 months ago, stood slightly apart from the other villagers, her gloved hands clasped tightly together, and her gaze fixed not on the tree but on the side door that led to the vestry. Most interesting of all, Miss Marple watched young Timothy Hargreaves, the village's most skilled woodcarver, as he fidgeted nervously beside the small table where the evening's crowning glory awaited its moment of triumph. The object of such anticipation was exquisite. A hand-carved wooden angel, no more than 8 inches tall, with delicate features painted in soft pastels and wings that seemed to shimmer with an almost ethereal quality. Timothy had spent months crafting it, and the entire village had followed its progress with the sort of keen interest usually reserved for royal pregnancies or cricket matches. The angel was to be placed atop the tree as the culmination of the evening's festivities, after which there would be carols, refreshments, and the comfortable satisfaction of another tradition successfully observed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Prowse called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had organized countless village events and lived to tell the tale. "If I might have your attention, please. Timothy will now place our beautiful angel atop the tree, and then we shall light it properly for the first time this season." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd as Timothy stepped forward, the precious angel cradled carefully in his work-worn hands. Miss Marple noticed that his fingers, usually so steady when working with wood, trembled slightly as he approached the step-ladder that had been positioned beside the tree. She also observed the way Mr. Larch's eyes followed Timothy's every movement, and how Mrs. Fletcher's breathing seemed to quicken as the moment approached. Timothy climbed the ladder with careful deliberation, the angel held securely in one hand while he gripped the ladder with the other. The hall fell silent except for the soft creak of wood and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. At the top of the tree, Timothy reached out to place the angel on its designated perch, and then stopped, his face draining of color. "It's gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's gone, dear?" Mrs. Prowse called up, though something in Timothy's tone had already begun to spread unease through the assembled crowd. "The bracket," Timothy replied, his voice growing stronger but no less troubled. "The special bracket I made to hold the angel. It's been removed." Indeed, where there should have been a carefully crafted wooden fitting designed to secure the angel safely to the tree's highest point, there was nothing but the bare branch, its tip freshly cut, as if someone had deliberately removed the mounting hardware. Timothy descended the ladder slowly, still clutching the angel, his face a mask of confusion and growing distress. "I don't understand," he said to the crowd that had begun to press closer. "I installed that bracket myself just this morning. It was perfectly secure." "Perhaps it simply fell," suggested Dr. Haydock, though his tone suggested he found this explanation as unlikely as everyone else did. "Wooden brackets don't simply fall," Mr. Larch said sharply, his treasurer's mind already calculating the implications. "Someone has deliberately tampered with it." It was then that Mrs. Fletcher spoke for the first time that evening, her cultured voice cutting through the murmur of confused conversation. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "we should check the vestry. If someone has been interfering with the preparations, they might have left other evidence." The suggestion was sensible, and Mrs. Prowse immediately dispatched her husband, the mild-mannered vicar, along with Mr. Larch and Timothy to investigate. The rest of the villagers waited in increasingly uncomfortable silence, the festive atmosphere evaporating like morning mist. When the three men returned 5 minutes later, their faces told the story before they spoke a word. The Reverend Prowse, usually the picture of clerical composure, looked positively ashen. "I'm afraid," he said, his voice barely steady, "that we must ask everyone to remain calm. There has been an incident." It was Mr. Larch who provided the terrible details, his treasurer's precision serving him even in crisis. "Mrs. Emmeline Cartwright has been found in the vestry. She appears to have been struck down. She is quite dead." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Mrs. Cartwright, the village's elderly organist and a fixture at every church function for the past 40 years, had been as much a part of St. Mary Mead as the ancient oak trees or the Norman tower of the church itself. "But that's impossible," someone whispered. "She was here just an hour ago, helping with the decorations." Miss Marple's knitting needles had stopped moving entirely, though her hands remained perfectly steady. Her eyes, sharp as winter frost, moved systematically around the room, noting reactions, cataloguing expressions, filing away the small details that others would overlook in their shock. She observed that Timothy Hargreaves still clutched the wooden angel, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. She noted that Mrs. Fletcher had gone very pale, but in a controlled way that suggested she was not entirely surprised by this turn of events. Most significantly, she saw that Mr. Larch kept glancing toward the vestry door with an expression that seemed less shocked than calculating. "The police must be called immediately," Dr. Haydock declared, taking charge with the natural authority of his profession. "Of course," Mrs. Prowse agreed faintly, "though I can't imagine. In St. Mary Mead, who could possibly—" But Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her, was already beginning to form theories. In her long experience, when angels went missing and people turned up dead, the connection was rarely coincidental. And when such things happened in a small village where everyone knew everyone else's business, the truth was usually hiding in plain sight, disguised as something perfectly ordinary. The Christmas tree stood forgotten now, its unlit fairy lights seeming to mock the darkness that had fallen over the gathering. The wooden angel, still clutched in Timothy's trembling hands, would not take its place atop the tree this evening. Instead, it had become something far more significant, a clue in what Miss Marple was already beginning to recognize as a most carefully planned murder. As the villagers began to file out of the hall under Dr. Haydock's gentle but firm direction, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting finally resumed, her needles clicking softly in the sudden quiet. She had much to think about, and thinking, as she had learned over many years of observation, was best done with busy hands and a peaceful mind. The angel was missing from the tree, but Miss Marple suspected that before this matter was resolved, they would discover that something far more precious had been stolen from St. Mary Mead, the life of a harmless old woman whose only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps, Miss Marple mused as her needles continued their steady rhythm, Mrs. Cartwright had been in exactly the right place to discover something that someone desperately needed to keep hidden. in which case the missing angel bracket was not the beginning of this mystery, but merely the most visible sign of a plan that had been set in motion long before the Christmas tree ceremony had begun. Within 20 minutes, the police had arrived from Much Benham, led by Inspector Craddock, a competent man in his 40s who had learned through previous encounters with St. Mary Mead that its placid exterior often concealed remarkably complex human dramas. He surveyed the scene with the methodical attention of someone who understood that in small villages, the most innocent details could prove significant, and that the residents' eagerness to help often revealed as much as their reluctance to speak. The village hall had transformed into something resembling a genteel inquisition, with clusters of villagers huddled together, their voices creating a low murmur of speculation and nervous energy. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing as she observed the subtle dynamics playing out before her. Right then, Inspector Craddock announced after completing his preliminary examination of the vestry, "I'll need statements from everyone present this evening. Dr. Haydock, what can you tell me about Mrs. Cartwright's condition?" Dr. Haydock stepped forward with professional composure. Single blow to the back of the head, delivered with considerable force. Death would have been instantaneous. The weapon appears to have been removed from the scene. Something heavy and blunt, I'd estimate. And when was she last seen alive? Mrs. Prowse, rallying her organizational instincts despite her distress, provided the timeline. She was helping with final preparations around 7:30. She mentioned wanting to check the music arrangements in the vestry before our ceremony began at 8 o'clock. Inspector Craddock made careful notes. "So we're looking at a window between 7:30 and when the body was discovered at approximately 8:15. He turned his attention to Timothy, who still clutched the wooden angel with white knuckles. "Tell me about this missing bracket." Timothy's voice wavered as he explained. "I'd installed it myself this morning. A special wooden fitting to secure the angel safely to the tree's highest point. When I climbed up to place the angel, it had been cleanly removed, cut away with a sharp blade." Miss Marple observed the way Timothy's thumb continued to trace small, soothing circles on the angel's base, a gesture she recognized as the sort of unconscious comfort one sought when deeply troubled. She also noted the fine pale dust on his sleeve. Not sawdust, but something finer, more like the powder that accumulated around old church silver when it was being polished. "Mrs. Fletcher," Inspector Craddock continued, "I understand you noticed something unusual about the vestry door?" Victoria Fletcher nodded, her gloved hands clasped tightly together. "When I arrived just before 8, I noticed the side door to the vestry was slightly ajar. It seemed odd, as it opens directly onto the churchyard and is usually kept locked during events." This revelation sent a ripple of unease through the assembled villagers. The side entrance meant that someone could have accessed the vestry without passing through the main hall, though it also raised questions about how such a person would have known Mrs. Cartwright would be there. "Inspector," Mr. Larch interjected, his face pale and his pocket watch clicking nervously in his hands. "There's something else you should know. Mrs. Cartwright had been, well, she'd been asking questions lately about the church finances. Nothing improper, you understand. Just the sort of thorough inquiries she was known for." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Inspector Craddock's attention focused sharply on the church treasurer. "What sort of questions, Mr. Larch?" "General matters," Mr. Larch replied quickly, though his obvious discomfort suggested the questions had been anything but general. "Expenditures, receipts, proper documentation. Emmeline was always very conscientious about church matters." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment as she processed this information. In her considerable experience, when elderly ladies began asking pointed questions about finances, they usually had good reason to do so. She glanced around the room, noting how Mr. Larch avoided eye contact with both the inspector and his fellow villagers, and how Timothy had gone very still at the mention of church finances. She was the sort who noticed everything, offered Mrs. Garside, the village's unofficial keeper of local history. 40 years as church organist, she saw every wedding, every funeral, every christening, heard conversations people thought were private. Emmeline was quiet, but quiet people often know the most, don't they? This observation struck Miss Marple as particularly astute. Mrs. Cartwright had indeed occupied a unique position in the village's social structure, present at every significant moment but often overlooked, like a piece of furniture that had become invisible through familiarity. Inspector Craddock was making extensive notes when Miss Marple rose from her chair and approached him with the diffident manner of an elderly lady who didn't wish to be presumptuous. "Inspector," she said gently, "I do hope you won't think me interfering, but I couldn't help noticing that Mrs. Cartwright's handbag appears to be missing." Inspector Craddock looked up sharply. "Missing?" "She never went anywhere without her small black leather handbag," Miss Marple explained. "Particularly not to church functions where she might need her reading glasses or throat lozenges for the choir. But I don't see it anywhere, either in the vestry or here in the hall." The inspector's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the implications. A missing handbag suggested either robbery or the removal of something specific that Mrs. Cartwright had been carrying. As the formal questioning continued, Miss Marple returned to her chair and resumed her knitting, but her mind was far from idle. The missing angel bracket, the unlocked side door, the questions about church finances, and now the missing handbag. Each element seemed insignificant on its own, but together they suggested a carefully orchestrated plan. She watched Timothy continue his nervous stroking of the wooden angel and wondered what connection, if any, existed between his obvious distress and the financial irregularities that had apparently caught Mrs. Cartwright's attention. She observed how Mrs. Fletcher kept her gloves on despite the warmth of the hall and noted the pale line around her ring finger that suggested jewelry recently removed. Most significantly, she listened to the undercurrent of conversation that flowed around the official questioning. The way people's theories about the crime revealed as much about their own secrets as about the murder itself. In Miss Marple's long experience, when a harmless elderly lady was killed in a small village, the motive was rarely as simple as it first appeared, and the truth was usually hidden among the very people who seemed most eager to help solve the mystery. The Christmas tree stood forgotten in the center of the hall, its unlit fairy lights casting strange shadows in the harsh electric lighting that had replaced the warm glow of the ceremony. The wooden angel, still clutched in Timothy's trembling hands, had become something far more significant than a simple decoration. It was now a piece of evidence in what Miss Marple was beginning to recognize as a most carefully planned crime. As Inspector Craddock continued his methodical questioning, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar fact that someone had taken the time to remove the angel bracket before committing murder. Such attention to detail suggested not panic or opportunity, but deliberate planning. Someone had wanted to ensure that the vestry would be searched, which meant they had either wanted Mrs. Cartwright's body discovered quickly or they had needed to create a specific sequence of events. The question was not just who had killed Mrs. Cartwright, but why they had felt compelled to do so on this particular evening and what they hoped to accomplish by ensuring that an angel could not take its proper place atop the Christmas tree. As Inspector Craddock concluded his preliminary questioning, the atmosphere in the hall had settled into that peculiar tension that follows shock when ordinary people suddenly find themselves players in an extraordinary drama. He gestured to Constable Reeves to maintain order, then returned to the vestry with Dr. Haydock and the Reverend Prowse for a more thorough examination. Miss Marple, with the unobtrusive purpose of someone offering to help with refreshments, drifted toward the corridor leading to the vestry, where Mrs. Prowse gratefully accepted her assistance in preparing tea. From the vestry doorway, Miss Marple could observe the narrow room with its oak presses for vestments, a small writing table beneath a frost-silvered window, and the side door leading to the churchyard. The metallic scent of cold brass mingled with furniture polish and damp wool, creating an atmosphere both familiar and ominous. Inspector Craddock, examining the writing table methodically, discovered a torn envelope addressed to the Church Wardens of St. Mary Mead. from the West Mercia Savings and Loan. The flap had been ripped cleanly, but no contents remained. A second scrap revealed the printed words, "Quarterly Statement." "Routine correspondence," Mr. Larch said quickly from the doorway, his voice strained. "I was expecting that particular statement." Miss Marple noticed that his explanation came too readily and that he clutched his pocket watch rather than reaching for a handkerchief despite his obvious distress. More intriguingly, she observed the same fine whitish powder on his cuff that she had seen on Timothy's sleeve, the telltale dust of whiting used to polish church brass and silver. Dr. Haydock's examination revealed that Mrs. Cartwright had been struck from behind while examining something at the writing table. "She likely never saw it coming," he reported grimly. The brass candlesticks from the chancel were brought down for polishing. Mrs. Prowse offered helpfully. "There should be 2 matched pairs." Inspector Craddock counted the ornate pieces carefully. "There are only 3 here. 1 is missing." The implication hung heavy in the air. A brass candlestick would serve admirably as a murder weapon, heavy enough to deliver a fatal blow, yet leaving no distinctive marks. Just then, young Jenny Hargreaves burst through the hall doors with the breathless urgency of someone bearing crucial information. "Inspector," she called out, her cheeks flushed from running, "I saw someone in the churchyard around 7:30 this evening. There was a light moving about near the old section by the Victorian graves." The hall fell silent as Jenny continued her testimony. "I couldn't make out who it was. Too dark, but they moved with confidence, as if they knew the layout well. No stumbling or hesitation." This revelation sent murmurs through the assembled villagers. Someone local, then, familiar enough with the churchyard to navigate it safely in darkness. "There's something else," Jenny added. "I saw Mr. Larch leaving his cottage in rather a hurry around, that same time, carrying what looked like a small case under his arm." All eyes turned to the church treasurer, whose face had gone ashen. I had forgotten some papers," Mrs. Prowse requested. "Financial records for the Christmas fund." Timothy suddenly spoke up, his voice tight with emotion. "Mr. Larch, you told me the Angel Commission was fully covered by donations from the Christmas fund." The accusation in his tone was unmistakable, and Miss Marple observed how several villagers exchanged meaningful glances. Whatever financial irregularities Mrs. Cartwright had been investigating clearly involved the very project that had brought them together this evening. "The fund is... There have been complications with the accounting," Mr. Larch admitted reluctantly. "Nothing improper, simply a matter of timing." Inspector Craddock's attention sharpened considerably. "Mr. Larch, we need to discuss these financial matters in detail." Miss Marple approached Timothy, who still held the wooden angel with trembling hands. "Such beautiful work," she murmured, her sharp eyes noting a tiny crescent of darkness at the figure's base, the thinnest sliver of paper, perhaps, pressed into the seam where wood met wood. "Mrs. Cartwright was so excited about it," Timothy said quietly. "She even offered to help with the mounting bracket, said she had ideas about making it more secure." This casual revelation struck Miss Marple as significant. If Mrs. Cartwright had been involved with the angel's installation, her presence in the vestry that evening would have been entirely predictable. Inspector Craddock carefully wrapped the angel in a tea towel. "For now, this stays with us," he announced, noting how several pairs of eyes followed the movement with varying expressions: anxiety, calculation, and something that might have been relief. As the formal questioning continued, Miss Marple reflected that whoever had removed the angel's bracket had wanted to ensure the vestry would be searched at precisely the right moment. The wooden angel, she mused, had become far more than a Christmas decoration. It was now a key piece in a carefully orchestrated plan where nothing had been left to chance. The truth, she suspected, lay hidden in the intersection of financial irregularities, predictable movements, and the peculiar importance everyone seemed to place on an angel that would now never reach its intended place atop the Christmas tree. The search party returned from the churchyard, with the evidence that transformed the investigation from speculation to stark reality. Constable Reeves approached Inspector Craddock with the careful precision of a man handling explosive materials, his breath visible in small puffs as he delivered his findings. "Inspector, we've found clear footprints in the frost leading from the side door along the U-walk and back again. Someone who knew the stepping stones well. No stumbling or hesitation." He produced a small brass screw bright at, the threads where it had been recently turned, and a length of twine knotted twice. These were scattered near the old Victorian section, along with this. This was Mrs. Cartwright's small black handbag, wet with frost and partially concealed beneath the spreading roots of an ancient yew. The discovery sent a collective gasp through the assembled villagers, and Mrs. Prowse pressed her handkerchief to her lips as Inspector Craddock carefully examined the contents under the harsh electric light. Inside were Mrs. Cartwright's spectacles in their worn case, a packet of throat lozenges, her church key ring, and most significantly, a folded piece of paper torn from a choir leaflet. In the organist's precise, slanted handwriting were the words, "Angel, base, secure if needed." Timothy stared at the note with genuine bewilderment. "I don't understand. The base is solid oak. I turned it myself from a single piece." Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the confusion. "Craftsmen do like to set their work cleverly, don't they, Timothy? Perhaps you created the base in 2 sections, a hollow to balance the weight, then a fitted cap?" The young woodcarver flushed and examined his hands. "Well, yes. There is a small cavity to lighten the piece for the top branch, but it's sealed permanently. I'd never—" He stopped abruptly, his face going pale as the implications dawned on him. Before anyone could respond, Constable Reeves returned once more, this time carrying an ornate brass candlestick wrapped in his coat. "Found this buried in a shallow grave near the Thornfield Monument, Inspector. Still has traces of— well, it matches the other 3 from the chancel." The murder weapon. Mr. Larch recoiled as if the brass had burned him, his face draining of all color. That's one of ours. From the altar." Inspector Craddock's expression grew grimmer as he examined the candlestick's base, noting the dark stains and several strands of grey hair caught in the ornate metalwork. The case against the church treasurer was building with devastating efficiency. Under renewed questioning, Mr. Larch's composure crumbled entirely. The financial irregularities he'd attempted to minimize proved far more serious. A shortfall of nearly £200 from the Christmas fund, money that should have covered Timothy's commission but had been temporarily redirected to cover Mr. Larch's gambling debts. "I was going to replace it," he insisted, his voice breaking. "Emmeline was asking too many questions, demanding to see receipts I couldn't produce, but I would never harm her." Yet the evidence painted a different picture. His presence in the churchyard at the crucial time, his access to the brass candlesticks, his desperate financial situation, and Mrs. Cartwright's growing suspicions about the missing funds, it all pointed inexorably toward the church treasurer as the killer. Miss Marple observed this development with the quiet attention of someone who had witnessed many such moments of apparent resolution. Her pale blue eyes moved from Mr. Larch's obvious distress to Mrs. Fletcher's carefully maintained composure, noting how the elegant newcomer kept her gloves firmly in place despite the warmth of the room. She observed the fine whitish powder, brass polish that several people bore on their clothing, and the way Timothy continued to stroke the wrapped angel with unconscious protectiveness. Most intriguingly, she reflected on the sequence of events that had led to this moment. Someone had deliberately removed the angel's mounting bracket, ensuring that the vestry would be searched at precisely the right time. Mrs. Cartwright's note suggested she had discovered the angel's secret purpose, but her murder seemed almost convenient for whoever had orchestrated this elaborate charade. As Inspector Craddock prepared to formally charge Mr. Larch, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the neat efficiency of the case. In her considerable experience, when guilt appeared so obvious and the evidence so perfectly aligned, the truth was usually hiding in plain sight, disguised as something perfectly innocent. The wooden angel, still wrapped in its tea-towel shroud, held secrets that went far beyond a simple financial scandal. Someone had planned this evening's events with meticulous care, counting on predictable human behavior and the assumption that the most obvious suspect was necessarily the guilty one. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared least capable of violence, those who understood that the best place to hide a lie was between two truths. As Inspector Craddock prepared to formally caution Mr. Larch, Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the proceedings with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising her tone. "Inspector, if I might venture a small observation. I do hope you won't think me presumptuous, but something about this case troubles me." The inspector, who had learned through previous encounters with St. Mary Mead that Miss Marple's observations were rarely as innocent as they appeared, paused in his official duties. "What concerns you, Miss Marple?" "It's simply that everything fits together rather too perfectly," she said, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. "In my experience, when human beings act desperately, they rarely leave such a tidy trail of evidence. Mr. Larch, you mentioned returning for forgotten papers around 7:30. Surely if you intended harm to Mrs. Cartwright, you wouldn't announce your presence to half the village." Mrs. Garside nodded vigorously from her position near the tea urn. "That's quite right, Miss Marple. Edwin was here in the main hall for at least 10 minutes discussing the heating bills with me. Very agitated about his financial troubles, certainly, but not murderous." This testimony sent a ripple of uncertainty through the assembled villagers. Inspector Craddock frowned as his neat case began to develop complications. "The evidence remains substantial, Miss Marple. The weapon, the motive, the opportunity." "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Almost too substantial, wouldn't you say? And then there's the matter of Mrs. Cartwright's note about the angel's base needing to be secured if needed. Timothy, you mentioned the base has a hollow chamber." Timothy nodded reluctantly, his face pale in the harsh electric light. "A small cavity to reduce weight for the top branch mounting, but it's permanently sealed. I crafted it that way." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes fixed on the wrapped angel with renewed interest. "Permanently sealed, yes. But Mrs. Cartwright was remarkably thorough in her examinations, wasn't she? 40 years a church organist, present at every significant moment, with an eye for detail that few possessed." She rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached a decision. "Inspector, might I suggest examining the angel more closely? I noticed earlier what appeared to be a tiny fragment of paper caught in the base's seam, barely visible, but there nonetheless." Under Inspector Craddock's watchful eye, Timothy unwrapped the wooden figure and demonstrated the hidden mechanism that allowed the base to separate. The hollow chamber within was empty, but as Miss Marple had observed, a thin crescent of paper remained trapped in the joint where wood met wood. "Someone opened this recently," Timothy said, his voice tight with emotion as he examined the faint tool marks around the inner rim. "These scratches are fresh, made with something other than my proper fitting tools." Inspector Craddock carefully extracted the paper fragment and held it to the light. The torn edge matched perfectly with the piece found in Mrs. Cartwright's handbag, but more significantly, it bore traces of printed text that suggested official documentation rather than simple correspondence. "Mrs. Cartwright discovered something hidden in the angel," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Something important enough that she made careful notes and kept backup records. In my experience, ladies of her generation were quite methodical about such things." As if summoned by her words, Constable Reeves returned from his continued search of the vestry, carrying a small envelope marked in Mrs. Cartwright's precise handwriting. "To be opened by the vicar, should anything happen to me." The prophetic nature of the inscription sent an involuntary shiver through the room. Inside, Inspector Craddock found not bank statements, but a carefully transcribed list of dates, amounts, and locations, along with detailed descriptions of jewelry and other valuable items. At the bottom, in Mrs. Cartwright's methodical script, was a single word that transformed the entire investigation: Thornfield. All eyes turned to Mrs. Fletcher, who had maintained her elegant composure throughout the evening, but now stood with the rigid posture of someone under considerable strain. Her gloved hands remained firmly clasped, and Miss Marple noticed how she had positioned herself near the door, as if prepared for a hasty departure. "Mrs. Fletcher," Miss Marple said gently, "you purchased Thornfield Cottage 18 months ago, I believe? Such a lovely property, though I understand it came with quite a bit of history." The elegant newcomer's carefully maintained facade showed the first signs of strain. "I fail to see how my residence relates to this tragic business, Miss Marple." But Inspector Craddock was already studying Mrs. Cartwright's documentation with growing understanding. The wooden angel, intended to crown the village's Christmas celebration, had been hiding secrets far more valuable than anyone had imagined. And Mrs. Cartwright, with her keen eye for detail and decades of observing human nature, had discovered a truth that someone had been willing to kill to protect. The case against Mr. Larch, so seemingly solid just moments before, was beginning to crumble as the real purpose behind the evening's carefully orchestrated events became clear. Someone had planned every detail with meticulous care, counting on the assumption that the most obvious suspect would be accepted without deeper investigation. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind was far from idle. The missing angel bracket, the unlocked side door, the carefully planted evidence, it all pointed to a plan that had been months in the making, waiting only for the right moment to unfold. Inspector Craddock studied Mrs. Cartwright's meticulous documentation with the growing comprehension of a man watching scattered pieces form a complete picture. The organist's careful script revealed not random observations, but a systematic investigation spanning 18 months. Detailed records of valuable items that had appeared and disappeared within the village, each entry noting dates, descriptions, and, most significantly, the occasions when certain individuals had been present. "Mrs. Fletcher," the inspector said, his voice carrying the weight of official inquiry, "these records suggest that Mrs. Cartwright had been documenting a pattern of thefts. Small but valuable pieces, Georgian silver, antique jewelry, porcelain figurines, items chosen by someone with considerable knowledge of their worth. The elegant newcomer's carefully maintained composure showed the first hairline cracks of strain. I'm sure I don't know what you're suggesting, Inspector. Emmeline was a dear woman, but she was known for her vivid imagination." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she considered this response. "Oh, but Mrs. Cartwright was remarkably practical, wasn't she? 40 years as church organist requires such attention to detail, knowing exactly who attends which services, who has access to which areas, who might be present when items go missing from various homes." Timothy, still examining the separated angel base under the harsh electric light, made a discovery that sent ripples of unease through the assembled villagers. "There are fresh tool marks inside the cavity," he announced, his voice tight with emotion. "Someone forced this open recently, and not with proper woodworking tools. These scratches suggest a kitchen knife or similar implement." The implication hung heavy in the air. Someone had discovered Mrs. Cartwright's hiding place and removed whatever evidence she had concealed there. "Timothy, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "did Mrs. Cartwright commission any special work from you recently? Beyond the angel itself, I mean." The young woodcarver flushed, his hands trembling as he held the violated base. "She came to me 3 weeks ago, asked me to create a secret compartment in the angel's base. Said it was for a special message she wanted to deliver to the vicar on Christmas Eve. She paid extra for discretion, made me promise not to mention it to anyone." This revelation transformed the entire investigation. Mrs. Cartwright hadn't simply stumbled upon evidence. She had been conducting a methodical investigation and had chosen the Christmas angel as her means of safely delivering her findings to church authorities. Inspector Craddock's attention focused sharply on Mrs. Fletcher, noting details he had previously overlooked. Despite the warmth of the hall, she kept her elegant kid gloves firmly in place, and there was a telltale pale line around her ring finger that suggested jewelry recently removed. Most significantly, he observed the fine coating of whitish powder on her coat sleeve, the distinctive residue of brass polish. "Mrs. Fletcher, you mentioned arriving at the hall just before 8 o'clock. Where were you during the earlier part of the evening?" Her answer came with a sort of precision that suggested careful rehearsal. "I spent the time at home, preparing refreshments for after the ceremony." But Mrs. Garside, whose memory for village comings and goings was encyclopedic, shook her head with gentle firmness. "I'm afraid that's not quite accurate, dear. I saw you walking toward the church around 7:15, coming from the direction of the old rectory path. You were carrying what appeared to be a small case or toolkit." The contradiction struck the assembled villagers like a physical blow. Mrs. Fletcher's carefully constructed timeline was unraveling with the same methodical precision that had characterized Mrs. Cartwright's investigation. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached an important conclusion. "Mrs. Fletcher, you visited Timothy's workshop several times while he was crafting the angel, didn't you? Such interest in the artistic process is admirable." "I appreciate fine craftsmanship," Mrs. Fletcher replied, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Of course you do," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "And I'm sure Timothy was happy to explain his techniques, the mounting system, the hidden compartment, all the clever details that made his work so special." Timothy's face went pale as he realized the implications. She asked very specific questions about how everything worked. I thought she was just being thorough, wanting to understand the piece that would crown our Christmas tree. The pieces were falling into place with devastating efficiency. Mrs. Fletcher had used her visits to Timothy's workshop to learn exactly how the angel's mounting system functioned, knowledge that proved crucial to her plan. By removing the bracket, she had ensured that the vestry would be searched at precisely the right moment, creating the perfect opportunity to eliminate Mrs. Cartwright while simultaneously framing Mr. Larch for the crime. Inspector Craddock's voice took on the formal tone of official proceedings. "Mrs. Fletcher, I must ask you to remove your gloves." The request met with immediate resistance, but when the gloves were finally removed under official insistence, they revealed hands bearing fresh scratches, consistent with forcing open wooden joints, along with unmistakable traces of brass polish from handling the murder weapon. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by an inconsistency that refused to be dismissed. "Mrs. Fletcher, you're clearly an intelligent woman who planned this evening's events with considerable care. But I'm puzzled by one crucial error in your reasoning." The accused woman's eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and unwilling curiosity. "And what might that be?" Miss Marple's pale blue eyes held steady, reflecting years of understanding human nature in all its complexity. "You assumed that Mrs. Cartwright kept her evidence hidden in the angel's base, but her note suggested she was trying to secure something there, not retrieve it. In my experience, when elderly ladies discover dangerous secrets, they're far too careful to keep all their evidence in one vulnerable location." This observation sent a chill through the room as the implications became clear. Mrs. Cartwright's murder might have been not only morally reprehensible but strategically pointless. The organist, with 4 decades of experience in observing human behavior, would have been far too methodical to risk everything on a single hiding place. The wooden angel, intended to crown St. Mary Mead's Christmas celebration with joy and hope, had instead become the centerpiece of a tragedy that revealed how the darkest human impulses could hide beneath the most respectable facades. And Mrs. Cartwright, even in death, was proving more prescient and thorough than her killer had ever imagined. As Inspector Craddock prepared to escort Mrs. Fletcher to the station for formal questioning, The Christmas tree stood forgotten in the center of the hall, its unlit fairy lights a mournful reminder of celebrations that would never be the same. The angel would not take its place atop the tree this year, but it had served a far more important purpose, helping to ensure that justice would be served for a harmless old woman whose only crime had been paying too much attention to the truth. As Inspector Craddock prepared to escort Mrs. Fletcher from the hall, Miss Marple's gentle voice once again cut through the proceedings with the quiet authority that had become familiar to those present. "Inspector, if I might suggest one small thing before you proceed." Mrs. Cartwright was remarkably methodical in her habits, and I can't help but wonder if she might have left additional guidance for us. The inspector paused, his hand on Mrs. Fletcher's arm, recognizing that Miss Marple's observations had proven invaluable throughout the evening. "What do you have in mind?" Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully around the hall before settling on the Reverend Prowse. "Vicar, Mrs. Cartwright spent 40 years organizing music for this church. She would have known every hiding place, every secure location where important items might be preserved. Might we examine her usual arrangements?" The suggestion carried the weight of practical wisdom, and Reverend Prowse, grateful for any action that might bring clarity to the evening's horrors, led them to the tall oak music cupboard that stood against the far wall. The warped door yielded reluctantly to his key, revealing neat rows of folders labeled in Mrs. Cartwright's precise handwriting. Miss Marple's fingers moved delicately along the spines until they paused at a folio bearing faded gilt letters, "Thornfield Memorial Service." She drew it out with the careful attention of someone who understood that the most significant discoveries often appeared entirely ordinary. The Thornfield family endowed the church garden in Victorian times. Mrs. Garside offered helpfully. Emmeline always kept their memorial music separate. Said it deserved special respect. Inside the folder's front pocket, Miss Marple discovered a small envelope pinned with the same methodical care that had characterized all of Mrs. Cartwright's arrangements. The envelope bore a note in that familiar slanted script, to be handed to the vicar with the Thornfield hymn. Inspector Craddock opened the envelope under the watchful eyes of the assembled villagers, revealing 2 items that transformed the investigation once again. The first was a delicate gold brooch set with seed pearls, which Mrs. Prowse immediately recognized as belonging to Mrs. Pierce of the Green, reported missing after the harvest festival. The second was a small iron key, worn smooth with age and bearing a crude cardboard tag reading "Side Door Duplicate." The implication struck the room like a physical blow. Someone had been using an unauthorized key to access the church, moving freely through the building while maintaining the appearance of legitimate presence. Mrs. Cartwright, with her characteristic thoroughness, had not only discovered this deception, but had systematically documented the evidence. "She found the brooch and kept it safe," Timothy said, his voice tight with emotion. "But why didn't she simply return it to Mrs. Pierce directly?" Miss Marple examined the worn key with the attention of someone who understood that the smallest details often revealed the largest truths. "Because, dear Timothy, returning a single item would have warned the thief to be more careful. Mrs. Cartwright was building a comprehensive case, gathering evidence of a pattern rather than addressing isolated incidents." Mrs. Fletcher, who had maintained her composure even under arrest, showed the first signs of genuine uncertainty as she stared at the duplicate key. "I've never seen that before in my life," she said, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. Inspector Craddock studied both women carefully, noting how the discovery of the unauthorized key complicated the neat case he had been building. "Mrs. Fletcher, you maintain you had no knowledge of this duplicate key?" "None whatsoever," she replied, though her gloved hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Constable Reeves, examining the key against the side door's lock, confirmed that it was indeed a perfect match. "Someone took considerable trouble to have this made, Inspector. This isn't amateur work. The cutting is precise, professional." Miss Marple observed the reactions around her with the keen attention that had served her well throughout the evening. Mrs. Fletcher's surprise appeared genuine, which suggested either exceptional acting ability or the possibility that the elegant newcomer was not the only person involved in the evening's crimes. The brass polish on multiple people's clothing, the systematic nature of Mrs. Cartwright's evidence-gathering, and now the discovery of an unauthorized key, all pointed to a more complex situation than a simple case of theft and murder. Mrs. Cartwright was protecting more than evidence, Miss Marple mused aloud, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. She was protecting people, ensuring that when the truth emerged, it would be complete and undeniable. The wooden angel, still wrapped in its tea-towel shroud, seemed to watch over the proceedings with the patient dignity of a witness to secrets that had yet to be fully revealed. Mrs. Cartwright's methodical approach to preserving evidence suggested that the organist had understood the full scope of what she was investigating and had taken extraordinary precautions to ensure that her discoveries would survive even if she did not. As Inspector Craddock carefully bagged the new evidence, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar fact that Mrs. Cartwright had chosen to hide different pieces of evidence in different locations. The angel's base for one purpose, the music folder for another. It suggested a woman who understood that the truth was too valuable to risk in a single hiding place. The Christmas tree stood forgotten in the center of the hall, its unlit fairy lights casting strange shadows in the harsh electric lighting. The evening that had begun with such festive anticipation had become something far more complex and troubling than anyone could have imagined. Yet Miss Marple sensed that they were still only seeing part of a larger picture, one that Mrs. Cartwright had been painstakingly documenting with the patience and precision that had characterized her 40 years of faithful service. The duplicate key raised questions that went far beyond Mrs. Fletcher's guilt or innocence. Someone had been using the church for purposes that required secrecy, moving through the building with the confidence that came from long familiarity. Mrs. Cartwright had discovered this deception and had begun the careful work of exposing it, but her murder suggested that the stakes were higher than simple theft from village homes. As the formal questioning continued, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the truth lay hidden in the intersection of Mrs. Cartwright's methodical investigation and someone's desperate need to prevent that investigation from reaching its conclusion. The wooden angel had been intended to crown the village's Christmas celebration, but instead it had become the key to unlocking secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. As Inspector Craddock prepared to escort Mrs. Fletcher from the hall, the sound of hurried footsteps on the frost-hardened path outside brought the proceedings to an abrupt halt. Constable Reeves burst through the doors, his face flushed from running and his expression bearing the particular urgency that accompanies the discovery of crucial evidence. "Inspector," he called out breathlessly, "we've found Mrs. Cartwright's cottage has been searched, thoroughly and professionally, drawers emptied, floorboards pried up, even the chimney examined. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for." The revelation sent a chill through the assembled villagers that had nothing to do with the December wind rattling the windows. Mrs. Fletcher's carefully maintained composure showed the first genuine crack of surprise, her gloved hands tightening involuntarily as she processed the implications. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their steady rhythm as she absorbed this development. "How very interesting," she murmured, her pale blue eyes taking on the sharp focus that those who knew her had learned to recognize. "And was anything actually taken, Constable?" "That's the curious thing, Miss Marple. Mrs. Cartwright's niece arrived from London this afternoon. She'd been expecting to help prepare for the Christmas ceremony. She says nothing valuable appears to be missing. The searchers seemed more interested in finding something specific than in general theft." Inspector Craddock's expression grew grimmer as the implications became clear. Someone knew Mrs. Cartwright had evidence hidden in her home, and they needed to find it before we did. Timothy, still clutching the wrapped angel with protective intensity, spoke up with sudden realization. "Mrs. Cartwright mentioned something 3 weeks ago when she commissioned the secret compartment. She said she'd been keeping careful records of unusual activities around the church, but she was worried about storing everything in one place. This observation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. "Quite sensible of her," she said approvingly. Ladies of Mrs. Cartwright's generation understood the wisdom of not keeping all their eggs in one basket, as it were. Mrs. Prowse, rallying her organizational instincts despite the evening's horrors, stepped forward with helpful precision. Emmeline was extraordinarily methodical about everything. She kept duplicate keys to the church in 3 separate locations, maintained backup copies of all the music arrangements, and even had spare reading glasses hidden in various spots throughout the building. The mention of multiple hiding places sent a visible tremor through several of the assembled villagers. Mr. Larch, whose earlier relief at being cleared of suspicion had been palpable, now showed signs of renewed anxiety. His pocket watch clicked nervously in his hands as he glanced repeatedly toward the vestry door. Miss Marple observed these reactions with the keen attention that had served her well throughout the evening. "Mrs. Prowse, you mentioned that Mrs. Cartwright kept spare items throughout the church building. Might she have used similar arrangements for her investigative materials?" The vicar's wife nodded thoughtfully. "It wouldn't surprise me in the least. Emmeline knew every nook and cranny of this church better than anyone. 40 years of organizing every detail creates quite an intimate knowledge of available spaces." Inspector Craddock turned his attention back to the duplicate key, examining it under the harsh electric light with renewed interest. "This key shows considerable wear, far more than occasional use would account for. Someone has been accessing the church regularly, perhaps for months or even years." Mrs. Fletcher, despite her arrest, showed genuine bewilderment at this development. "Inspector, I've only lived in St. Mary Mead for 18 months. Before that, I was in London. I've never had any reason to require unauthorized access to the church." But Miss Marple was studying the key with the particular attention she reserved for details that others might overlook. "The wear pattern is quite distinctive," she observed quietly. "This key has been used not just frequently, but with familiarity, the sort of comfortable handling that comes from long practice." Timothy suddenly straightened, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and realization. The previous owner of Thornfield Cottage, Mr. Alistair Finch, he had a key to the church for his historical research. He spent considerable time in the vestry, cataloguing old parish records and examining the Victorian donation boxes. This revelation sent ripples of understanding through the assembled villagers. Mrs. Garside nodded vigorously. Alistair was quite devoted to church history. He even reorganized some of the old storage areas, said he wanted to preserve important documents properly. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "And when did Mr. Finch pass away, if I might ask?" "Nearly 2 years ago," Mrs. Prowse replied. "His cottage stood empty for several months before Mrs. Fletcher purchased it from the estate." The timeline was becoming clearer, and Inspector Craddock could see the pieces beginning to form a more complex picture. Someone with access to Mr. Finch's key had been using the church for purposes that went far beyond historical research, and Mrs. Cartwright's keen eye for detail had eventually detected the irregularities. Mrs. Cartwright was protecting more than just evidence, Miss Marple said softly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. She was protecting the sanctity of a place she had served faithfully for 40 years. When she discovered that someone was violating that trust, she began her careful investigation. The wooden angel, still wrapped in its tea-towel shroud, seemed to watch over the proceedings with the patient dignity of a witness to secrets that were slowly being revealed. Mrs. Cartwright's methodical approach to documenting evidence had ensured that even in death, she continued to guide the investigation toward the truth. As Inspector Craddock made arrangements for a thorough search of the church building, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar fact that someone had felt confident enough to search Mrs. Cartwright's cottage so thoroughly while the police investigation was actively underway. Such boldness suggested either desperation or the comfortable assumption that suspicion had been successfully diverted elsewhere. The Christmas tree stood forgotten in the center of the hall, its unlit fairy lights casting strange shadows in the harsh electric lighting. The evening that had begun with such festive anticipation had become something far more complex and troubling than anyone could have imagined. Yet Miss Marple sensed that they were approaching the heart of the mystery. At last, guided by Mrs. Cartwright's careful preparations and the understanding that the truth often hid behind the most respectable facades. The duplicate key had opened more than doors. It had opened a window into a carefully constructed deception that someone had been willing to kill to protect. And Mrs. Cartwright, even in death, was proving more thorough and prescient than her murderer had ever anticipated. The systematic search of the church building revealed Mrs. Cartwright's extraordinary thoroughness in ways that demonstrated both her methodical nature and the true scope of what she had uncovered. Behind the carved wooden screen separating the chancel from the nave, Constable Reeves discovered a small tin box wedged between ancient stones, its contents protected by layers of oiled cloth that spoke to the organist's understanding of proper preservation techniques. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, taken with the careful attention to detail that characterized all of Mrs. Cartwright's work. Each image showed the interior of various village homes, focusing on specific pieces of furniture, artwork, and decorative objects. More significantly, each photograph was dated and annotated in her precise handwriting, creating an irrefutable record of items that had subsequently disappeared from their original locations. Miss Marple examined the photographs with the keen interest of someone who understood that the most damning evidence often appeared perfectly innocent to casual observers. "How very clever of her," she murmured, noting the way Mrs. Cartwright had captured not just the objects themselves, but their specific placement within each room. These weren't random snapshots. They were deliberate documentation of a systematic campaign. The second major discovery came from the old vestry fireplace, where a loose brick concealed a leather-bound ledger marked Thornfield Family Donations and Endowments, 1850-1920. Its meticulous entries detailed not only monetary gifts, but also specific items of art and jewelry bequeathed to the church over 70 years. Alongside it lay a tarnished silver locket bearing the intricate Thornfield family crest. Inspector Craddock spread both sets of evidence across the vestry table, his expression growing grimmer as the connections became clear. "She was documenting two separate but related crimes," he said slowly. "Contemporary thefts from village homes and historical appropriation of church assets that should have been part of the official inventory." Miss Marple observed the way several villagers reacted to these revelations, noting particularly how Mrs. Fletcher's carefully maintained composure showed subtle cracks of genuine surprise, while others displayed the sort of nervous energy that suggested uncomfortable familiarity with the evidence being revealed. "The photographs show remarkable knowledge of each home's layout and contents," Miss Marple observed quietly, her pale blue eyes moving systematically around the room. The photographer had intimate access. Not the hurried glimpses of a casual visitor, but the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged in these spaces. Timothy, examining the historical ledger with growing understanding, made a connection that sent visible unease through several of the assembled villagers. Mrs. Cartwright mentioned that whoever was taking items from people's homes knew exactly where to find the most valuable pieces. They weren't searching randomly. They went straight to specific objects as if they had detailed knowledge of what each household contained. The implication was unmistakable. Someone had been conducting reconnaissance over an extended period, using their trusted position in the community to catalog valuable items before systematically removing them. The church, with its multiple entrances and numerous hiding places, had served as the perfect base of operations for coordinating these activities. Mrs. Prowse, examining the photographs with growing horror, identified several items that had been reported missing over the past 18 months. "That's Mrs. Henderson's silver tea service," she said, pointing to one image, and that porcelain figurine belonged to old Colonel Westcott before he passed away last spring. Jenny Hargreaves, who had remained quietly observant throughout the evening's revelations, stepped forward with information that transformed their understanding of the disposal method. "Inspector, there's something about the antique shop in Much Benham. My aunt works there part-time, and she's mentioned several times how they've been receiving unusually fine pieces from a private collector who prefers to remain anonymous." This revelation provided the missing link in understanding how stolen goods had been converted to profit without arousing suspicion. The antique trade, conducted through intermediaries who asked few questions about provenance, offered the perfect mechanism for disposing of valuable items far from their original locations. As Inspector Craddock arranged the evidence chronologically, the systematic nature of the operation became clear. Someone had been targeting recently bereaved households and homes where elderly residents might not immediately notice missing items. The pattern showed not opportunistic crime, but careful planning based on intimate knowledge of village circumstances and vulnerabilities. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached a crucial understanding. Mrs. Cartwright's investigation was approaching its conclusion, she said quietly, her knitting needles moving with thoughtful precision. Someone realized that 40 years of careful observation had finally detected their activities, and they needed to act decisively to protect themselves. It was then that the lights flickered once, twice, and failed entirely, plunging the hall into darkness save for the wavering glow of Timothy's lantern. In the confusion that followed, voices calling out, the scrape of chairs, someone stumbling in the sudden blackness, came the unmistakable sound of rapid footsteps and a muffled crash from the direction of the vestry. When Constable Reeves restored power moments later, they discovered Mr. Larch on the floor near the evidence table, a trickle of blood bright against his temple and his face pale with shock. "Someone pushed me," he managed between gasps. "I was just trying to help, and someone struck me from behind." More significantly, the wrapped wooden angel had vanished from its place on the table. Inspector Craddock's expression hardened as he realized the implications. Someone had used the darkness and confusion to retrieve the one piece of evidence that might still contain secrets. The angel that Mrs. Cartwright had specifically requested be modified with a hidden compartment, and which someone had been desperate enough to kill for. Miss Marple stood very still in the restored light, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene with the sharp attention that had served her well throughout the evening. The theft of the angel represented more than simple evidence tampering. It suggested that whoever had killed Mrs. Cartwright still believed the wooden figure contained something crucial to their exposure. "The person who took the angel," she said softly, "understands that Mrs. Cartwright's investigation was more complete than anyone realized. They're not just covering their tracks, they're racing against time to prevent a final revelation that could destroy them entirely." The Christmas tree stood forgotten in the center of the hall, its intended crown now stolen by someone desperate enough to risk everything on one final gamble. But Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Cartwright, with her characteristic thoroughness, had prepared for exactly such a contingency. The wooden angel might be gone, but the truth it represented would not be so easily silenced. As Inspector Craddock organized an immediate search of the building and grounds, Miss Marple reflected that they were approaching the moment when careful planning would give way to desperate action, and when the most dangerous person in St. Mary Mead would finally be forced to reveal themselves completely. The search for the stolen angel proved both swift and revelatory, though not in the manner Inspector Craddock had anticipated. Constable Reeves discovered the wooden figure within minutes, abandoned behind the ancient baptismal font, where desperation had overcome careful planning. The angel lay unwrapped on the cold stone floor, its base forced open with such violence that splinters of oak scattered around it like evidence of a crime within a crime. Miss Marple examined the damaged figure with the careful attention of someone who understood that panic often revealed more than the most methodical planning ever could. The crude tool marks spoke of hasty, desperate work performed under pressure, a stark contrast to the meticulous precision that had characterized the evening's earlier crimes. "How very telling," she murmured, noting the empty cavity within the violated base. Someone discovered that Mrs. Cartwright's final secret wasn't hidden where they expected to find it. Inspector Craddock studied the crude damage with growing understanding. Whoever did this was working in darkness, under enormous pressure, with inadequate tools. They took extraordinary risks for something that proved worthless. It was then that Miss Marple made the observation that transformed their understanding of the entire evening's events. "Inspector, I believe we've been approaching this investigation from quite the wrong direction. We've assumed that Mrs. Cartwright was killed to prevent her from revealing what she had discovered. But what if she was killed because she had already arranged to reveal it?" The suggestion sent ripples of unease through the assembled villagers. Timothy, examining his damaged creation with the heartbroken attention of a craftsman seeing months of work destroyed, looked up with sudden comprehension. "She asked me to deliver the angel personally to the vicar after the ceremony," he said slowly. "Not just to be placed on the tree, but to be handed over with her special Christmas compliments." Reverend Prowse stepped forward with dawning understanding. "Emmeline did mention she had prepared a special message for me, something that would be delivered through the angel ceremony. I assumed she meant the spiritual significance of the moment." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes took on the sharp focus that those who knew her had learned to recognize as the moment when scattered pieces formed a complete picture. Mrs. Cartwright had already prepared her final revelation. The angel was meant to be her messenger, carrying information directly to church authorities in a public setting where it couldn't be suppressed or ignored. The implications struck the room with the force of revelation. Someone had killed Mrs. Cartwright not to prevent her from speaking, but to prevent the angel ceremony from proceeding as planned, ensuring that her carefully prepared message would never reach its intended destination. As this understanding settled over the gathering, Miss Marple observed the subtle reactions with the keen attention that had served her throughout the evening. Most showed genuine surprise or growing comprehension, but one person displayed the careful composure of someone who had been expecting exactly this development. Mrs. Garside, the village's unofficial keeper of historical knowledge, stood with the rigid posture of someone under considerable strain. Her usual animated helpfulness had given way to a watchful stillness, and Miss Marple noted how her gloved hands remained firmly clasped, avoiding the unconscious gestures that had marked her behavior throughout the evening. "Mrs. Garside," Miss Marple said gently, her knitting needles resuming their thoughtful rhythm, "you've been remarkably helpful this evening, sharing so much valuable information about village history and residents' habits. Such comprehensive knowledge must come from years of careful observation." The historian's response came with fractional hesitation. "I've always taken an interest in preserving our local heritage, Miss Marple. It's important work." "Indeed it is," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "And I'm sure your familiarity with every household's treasures and family histories has been invaluable over the years. You would know, for instance, exactly which families possessed items of particular value, and when those families might be most vulnerable to losses." The color began to drain from Mrs. Garside's face as the implications became clear. Inspector Craddock's attention sharpened considerably as he recognized the direction of Miss Marple's gentle interrogation. "The duplicate key shows years of wear," Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its characteristic mildness. "Someone with legitimate historical research interests, perhaps someone who had worked closely with Mr. Finch during his cataloguing efforts, would have had every reason to possess such access." Mrs. Garside's carefully maintained composure showed the first visible cracks. "I helped Alistair with his research, certainly, but that hardly suggests—" "Of course not," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But Mrs. Cartwright's photographs show remarkable knowledge of each home's layout and contents. The sort of intimate familiarity that comes not from casual visits, but from the trusted access granted to someone preserving local history, collecting family stories and documenting treasured possessions for posterity. The accusation hung in the air with the weight of inevitable truth. Mrs. Garside had used her position as village historian to conduct reconnaissance over years, identifying valuable items before systematically removing them. Her encyclopedic knowledge of family circumstances and vulnerabilities had made her the perfect predator, hiding in plain sight behind a facade of scholarly interest and community service. Inspector Craddock stepped forward with the authority of official proceedings. "Mrs. Garside, I believe we need to discuss your activities in considerably more detail." But Miss Marple held up a gentle hand, her pale blue eyes never leaving the historian's face. "There's one more thing that puzzles me, Mrs. Garside. Mrs. Cartwright was remarkably thorough in her preparations. I suspect she didn't rely solely on the angel to deliver her message. Ladies of her generation always prepared for contingencies." The final piece of psychological pressure proved decisive. Mrs. Garside's composure crumbled entirely as she realized that even if she had successfully prevented the angel's delivery, Mrs. Cartwright's methodical nature meant there would be other revelations waiting to surface. The wooden angel lay broken on the vestry table, its intended message intercepted, but its purpose ultimately fulfilled. Mrs. Cartwright's careful planning had anticipated even this final desperate gambit, ensuring that the truth would emerge despite the most determined attempts to suppress it. As Inspector Craddock prepared for the formal conclusion of his investigation, Miss Marple reflected that they had reached the moment when years of careful deception would finally be exposed, and when the most trusted member of St. Mary Mead's community would be revealed as its most dangerous predator. The Christmas tree stood forgotten in the center of the hall, its intended crown now broken and abandoned, but the truth it had helped to reveal would prove far more valuable than any decoration could ever be. The confession, when it finally came, unfolded with the methodical precision that had characterized Mrs. Garside's crimes over the years. She sank into the wooden chair that Miss Marple had vacated, her hands folded with the resigned composure of someone who understood that decades of carefully constructed deception had finally reached their inevitable conclusion. "It began quite innocently," Mrs. Garside said, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone recounting events from a great distance. "Working with Alistair Finch on his historical research gave me access to so many homes, so many family treasures that people barely noticed anymore. When he died and left me his duplicate key, it seemed wasteful not to continue the work." Miss Marple observed quietly, her knitting needles resuming their thoughtful rhythm. "But it wasn't preservation you had in mind, was it, Mrs. Garside? It was opportunity? Your position as village historian provided perfect cover for systematic reconnaissance, learning which families possessed valuable items when they might be most vulnerable to loss." Inspector Craddock's methodical questioning revealed the full scope of an operation that had been hidden behind decades of respected community service. Mrs. Garside had used her encyclopedic knowledge of village families and their circumstances to identify targets with clinical precision. Recent bereavements, elderly residents living alone, families distracted by illness or financial troubles, all had become opportunities for someone who understood human vulnerability with predatory accuracy. "The church served as your staging area," Miss Marple continued with gentle inexorability. "The side door, the vestry storage areas, the perfect cover of legitimate historical research. You could move stolen items through the building, photograph them for your records, and arrange their disposal through the antique shop in Much Benham without arousing suspicion." The most devastating revelation concerned Mrs. Cartwright's extraordinary thoroughness in preparing her case. As Inspector Craddock had suspected, the organist's 40 years of observing village life had made her uniquely qualified to detect the subtle patterns that others missed. "Emmeline confronted me 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Garside admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She had been documenting everything, not just the thefts, but my movements, my research visits, the correlation between my presence and subsequent disappearances. She gave me one opportunity to confess voluntarily before she delivered her evidence through the Christmas angel ceremony. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. Mrs. Cartwright was far too methodical to rely on a single hiding place. Timothy, might we examine Mrs. Cartwright's choir robe in the vestry? I suspect she prepared for exactly this contingency. The discovery in the lining of the organist's robe proved decisive. A complete inventory of stolen items, their disposal methods, and most damning of all, detailed observations of Mrs. Garside's activities over 18 months. Mrs. Cartwright had documented not only contemporary thefts, but also the systematic appropriation of historical church assets that should have been part of the official inventory. Under the weight of irrefutable evidence, Mrs. Garside's carefully maintained facade crumbled entirely. The woman who had spent decades presenting herself as the guardian of village heritage revealed herself as its most calculating predator. "I never intended for anyone to be hurt," she insisted, though her words carried little conviction. When I found Emmeline in the vestry examining the angel's base, I realized she had discovered my final hiding place. The panic, the desperation. I struck out without thinking. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes reflected both sadness and steel. "But you had thought, hadn't you, Mrs. Garside? You removed the mounting bracket to ensure the vestry would be searched at precisely the right moment. You counted on Mr. Larch's financial troubles to divert suspicion from the real motive. That suggests considerable premeditation." As Inspector Craddock completed the formal procedures, the full scope of Mrs. Garside's betrayal became clear. She had violated not just property, but trust itself, using her position as keeper of village history to prey upon the very people she claimed to serve. The antique shop investigation would eventually recover many stolen items, though others had been lost forever to private collectors who asked no questions about provenance. Timothy, examining the broken remains of his wooden angel with the heartbroken attention of a craftsman seeing months of work destroyed, spoke with quiet determination. "I'll carve another angel for next year's ceremony. Something even more beautiful as a proper memorial to Mrs. Cartwright." The Christmas tree stood in the center of the hall, its fairy lights finally illuminated in the restored calm that followed the evening's dramatic conclusion. Without its intended crown, the tree seemed somehow more humble, more human, but no less beautiful for its imperfection. Miss Marple gathered her knitting materials with the peaceful movements of someone whose work was complete. As the villagers began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the evening's extraordinary revelations, she reflected on the peculiar nature of evil that hides behind respectability. "The most dangerous criminals," she observed to Inspector Craddock, "are often those who appear most helpful, most knowledgeable, most devoted to community service." Mrs. Garside used decades of trust to perfect her predatory skills, but she underestimated the power of patient, methodical observation. The village of St. Mary Mead would recover from this evening's revelations, as it had recovered from other tragedies over the years. The truth, though painful, was always preferable to the comfortable lies that allowed evil to flourish in darkness. Mrs. Cartwright, with her quiet diligence and methodical attention to detail, had proven that evil could not indefinitely escape the consequences of its actions. Her wooden angel, though broken, had delivered its message of justice with perfect precision. As Miss Marple walked home through the frost-silvered streets, she reflected that even the darkest human impulses could not ultimately triumph over the patient, persistent pursuit of truth. The Christmas celebration would continue in St. Mary Mead, perhaps with greater appreciation for the simple virtues of honesty, kindness, and genuine service to others. The angel was missing from the tree, but justice had found its proper place in the hearts of those who remained to carry forward the true spirit of Christmas. Not in grand gestures or elaborate decorations, but in the quiet courage to stand up for what was right, even when the cost was dear. In her cottage that night, Miss Marple completed the pink scarf she had been knitting throughout the evening's events. Each stitch had been a witness to revelation, each pattern a reminder that the most complex mysteries often revealed themselves through the simplest observations of human nature. Mrs. Cartwright's final gift to her community had been the demonstration that truth, like good knitting, required patience, precision, and the understanding that every detail mattered in creating something beautiful and lasting.